We're officially kicking off the first video of 2026, and I couldn't start without wishing all of you the best year possible. Thank you so much for supporting me. In this video, we're exploring 3 stories of people who ventured into the Appalachian Mountains during the winter months, especially right after the New Year. And instead of finding peace and solitude, they came across something truly terrifying. After spending some quality time with my family, I was definitely eager to come back to the channel. So thank you for being here. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised. What I'm about to tell you happened exactly 2 years ago, during a time when the only thing I truly wanted was to forget that we had just stepped into a brand new year. I've always hated this period, and I should make it clear that it was never due to a lack of family support or people to spend New Year's with. Since quite the opposite, New Year's has always been a festive, loud, and genuinely joyful time in my family, full of food, laughter, and tradition. What I've always despised, however, were New Year's resolutions, and the whole premise that now, suddenly, everything was supposed to change simply because the calendar had flipped, as if starting a new year automatically meant starting a new life. Something I've always found deeply dishonest, because in my mind, people cling to that idea to fool themselves, failing to understand that real change happens every single day through the choices we make. That being said, now that you understand a bit better why, at the beginning of every year, I feel an almost physical need to distance myself, especially from social media and society in general. It'll make more sense why I decided to go hiking and camping alone in the forests that surround my town. I've lived my entire life in the state of Pennsylvania, in a relatively remote rural area. Not remote in the extreme, storybook sense where civilization barely exists, but remote enough that not much ever really happens. And growing up there meant that the forest and the mountains were always a central part of my life. I loved them, and I spent a huge portion of my childhood exploring them, because my parents used to take me and my brother on long hikes and taught us how to survive out there, how to read the terrain, how to respect nature and its animals, and how not to panic when things didn't go exactly as planned. Which is why, when I left my house on January 1st and headed straight toward the forest, I wasn't intimidated in the slightest. I'd been doing this my whole life. Originally, I planned to start my hike from a trail very close to my house, but I had heard that heavy snow had blocked the access point, and since it was still New Year's Day, the road hadn't been cleared yet. So instead, I ended up choosing a different entry point, one that was farther away and that I had never personally used before. Even so, that didn't concern me much, because to me, a forest is a forest. The rules are the same, the dangers are the same, and the precautions you need to take don't suddenly change just because the area is unfamiliar. Still, almost immediately after entering the woods, I felt something was wrong. I can't explain exactly what it was, and I don't want this to sound like a cheap cliche, but it's the truth. The forest looked exactly the same as it always had. Quiet, snow-covered, and still. Yet I felt like I was being watched constantly. Even though there were no voices, no footsteps, and nothing rational that should have made me feel that way. And despite trying to convince myself that it was all in my head, the feeling refused to leave. Looking back, I know I should have listened to my instinct and turned around, maybe explored a different area, or just gone home altogether. But because I couldn't find a logical explanation for that sensation, and because I've always needed logic to justify my decisions, I convinced myself that the smartest thing to do was to keep going. As time passed, the feeling didn't fade. Instead, it intensified. Sometimes to the point where I would suddenly stop and turn around, scanning the trail behind me and the trees around it, fully expecting to see someone walking just a few steps back. Every single time, all I saw was an empty path, which brought a strange mix of relief and unease, because the absence of proof didn't make the feeling go away. Eventually, overwhelmed by that constant sensation and afraid that I might just be spiraling into paranoia, I decided it would be best to call it a day, find a place that felt safe enough, set up camp, and try to sleep as early as possible, telling myself that the next day would be different and that everything would feel normal again. It didn't take long to find a spot that seemed ideal, with snow packed just right to pitch the tent securely. And once everything was set up, I went through my usual camping routine, making a simple dinner, preparing some tea, and watching a few downloaded gaming videos or whatever else I had on my phone to pass the time. I don't remember what I watched that night, only that I felt completely exhausted and ended up falling asleep much earlier than I normally would. I woke up suddenly at 11:30 p.m. with a feeling of pure dread, because I was certain I had just heard someone outside my tent say hello. On its own, hello is a harmless word, almost friendly. But hearing it in the middle of the night, deep in the forest, was absolutely terrifying. And when I heard it a second time, I physically felt every hair on my body stand on end. I hesitated, debating whether I should open the tent or stay inside. But the thought of remaining in complete darkness while someone stood just outside felt worse than facing whoever it was. So I grabbed the knife I always carry with me and slowly unzipped the tent. Standing there was one of the strangest men I have ever seen in my life. His face felt completely out of place in that setting, and he had the most unsettling combination of expressions I've ever encountered, somehow managing to look both harmless and deeply disturbing at the same time. His smile was far too wide, frozen on his face, and his eyes were off in a way I can't fully explain. Empty, but clearly hiding something beneath the surface. In his hand, he held a knife, angled in a way that left no doubt about how easily it could be used against me. And while there was no question in my mind that his intentions were probably violent, there was something about him that didn't fit together logically. In a strange way, I remember thinking that if I'd seen that same man in a kindergarten playground, without the knife, I probably wouldn't have thought twice about him. And that contradiction alone made everything feel even more wrong. My mind was racing, filled with opposing thoughts. And the first clear realization I had was that running to my pickup truck would be pointless. I felt frozen, not just because of the immediate threat, but because this was the confirmation I hadn't wanted. That he had been following me the entire day. Almost immediately after that realization, another question surfaced. If he had been following me, why hadn't he done anything sooner? And why hadn't he attacked me while I was asleep? Those thoughts collided in my head, and despite wanting to say something, anything, I realized I hadn't managed to speak a single word. Fear and shock have a way of silencing you completely. When I finally spoke, I told him I had a weapon. He didn't react the way I expected. He just smiled even wider, and calmly said that it didn't matter what I had, because my ending would be the same. And that, more than anything else, felt like a real threat. His smile never left his face, and all I could think about was how badly I wanted to wipe it away. That's when I remembered the thermos I had with me, filled with tea that was still boiling hot. I twisted the lid off and threw the scalding water straight into his eyes. As he stumbled backward, screaming, I grabbed my emergency backpack and ran. I wasn't running blindly or panicking without direction. I knew exactly where I was going. Straight toward the nearest town, only a few miles away. And if everything went right, I figured I could reach it in under 2 hours. Several times, I glanced over my shoulder to make sure he wasn't behind me. But deep down, I already knew he wasn't chasing me. I was almost certain I had blinded him. And even if I hadn't, he would have been disoriented and unsure of which direction I'd gone. When I finally reached the town, I called the police and immediately went to a motel I knew would still be open at that hour. And when I explained that I just needed a safe place to wait for the police, the staff were incredibly kind and did everything they could to help. The police were just as supportive. They took my statement and drove me home. But it wasn't until the next day that they went back to the campsite. By then, my tent had been completely destroyed, and several of my belongings were missing. It was obvious that, frustrated by the fact that he hadn't caught me, he had taken his anger out on my things. But none of that mattered to me. I was simply grateful to be alive, and I couldn't help but hope that maybe, by escaping, I had prevented him from doing the same thing to someone else. No trace of the man was ever found, and even though the investigation is technically still open, there have been no developments to this day. I suspect I'll never know what that man truly wanted, or whether I left him with a permanent injury. But one thing I do know for certain is that I never went camping alone again. From that day on, I always make sure to bring at least 2 friends with me. What I'm about to describe happened a little over 3 years ago, during a stretch of my life when I still believed that spending time in nature was one of the safest ways to clear my head. Because back then, I associated the forest with silence, isolation, and control, not danger, and certainly not the kind of fear that stays with you long after the moment itself has passed. At that time, I was living in northern Pennsylvania, working a job that paid the bills but drained me mentally, and whenever I had a free weekend, I tried to disappear into the woods for a night or two, convincing myself that being away from everything would somehow reset whatever felt broken inside me. I also know that a large part of you won't believe what we saw that night, but the truth is that we did see it. And even though we don't understand it, all 3 of us know, without any doubt, that it was real. That particular trip wasn't planned impulsively. It wasn't something I did alone, because I was joined by 2 close friends, people I trusted completely, both physically capable and experienced outdoors, to the point where none of us felt even remotely concerned about safety. We chose a familiar stretch of forest, one we had visited before during daylight hours. And although it was deep enough to feel isolated, it wasn't far from old logging roads and abandoned trails, which gave us a false sense of reassurance. We arrived in the late afternoon, hiked for a couple of hours, and set up camp just as the light started to fade. And everything about the environment felt normal, almost disappointingly so, with the air cold but manageable, the forest quiet except for the occasional wind moving through the trees, and absolutely nothing to suggest that the night ahead would be any different from the dozens of other nights we had spent outdoors together. We cooked, ate, talked for a while, and eventually settled into our sleeping bags, confident that the hardest part of the trip was already behind us. At some point during the night, I woke up because I thought one of my friends had gotten up to go to the bathroom. Since I wasn't fully awake, and there was no real reason for me to get up as well, I stayed where I was, suspended in that half-asleep state, still drowsy, but slightly alert. That was when, somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard a scream. I sat up immediately, confused, convincing myself that I had probably just dreamed the sound. As my awareness sharpened, I became conscious of movement outside the tent. Not footsteps exactly, but the unmistakable sound of weight shifting against leaves and branches. Could it have been one of my friends? I looked around and saw that both of them were still inside the tent with me. I focused on their breathing, trying to calm myself and convince myself that I was overreacting. But one by one, I felt them wake up as well. Not through words or obvious movement, but through that subtle shift in the air. The shared tension that settles in when multiple people realize that something isn't right. I asked them if they had heard a scream, and both of them shook their heads no, but immediately sat up and stayed alert with me. That was when we heard one of the most terrifying sounds I have ever heard in my life. Made even worse by the fact that we were in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of night. It sounded like a woman, or several women, screaming and whispering at the same time. It didn't sound real at all, and I honestly believe that if they hadn't been there with me and if all three of us hadn't heard it, I would have doubted my own sanity. That was when Manuel, one of my friends, decided he was going to unzip the tent and try to understand what was happening. I felt completely petrified where I was, because I'm the only one in the group who believes in paranormal things, and what we were experiencing felt exactly like that to me. I was absolutely terrified. Manuel quickly pulled his head back inside the tent and, with the most chilling voice I've ever heard come out of another human being, said that there was a woman standing outside. The sound had started again, and it was impossible for it to be just one woman. I told him it had to be several. I tried to look through the small window of the tent, and that was when I saw her. She was completely dressed in white, with long black hair, and an expression that was completely empty, completely dead. In that moment, I knew that one of two things was true. Either I was looking at someone who was extremely close to death, or I was looking at someone who had already died. My friends noticed my panic and looked outside the tent again, and that was when I heard Juan say that she was floating. I didn't need to hear anything else. I immediately said that we had to get out of there. I didn't care who she was. I didn't care why she was making that sound. I just wanted to leave. There was no discussion. Both of them agreed with me instantly, grabbed their backpacks, and we took off running away from the campsite. As I ran, I was terrified of breaking an ankle because I felt completely out of control, sprinting across uneven ground with a flashlight that didn't shine straight ahead, but bounced wildly with every step I took. Fortunately, we hadn't gone too far from the car, and in less than 30 minutes we were inside it, speeding away as fast as we could. To this day, I still don't understand what I saw. I don't understand the sound, and I don't understand what that woman was. All I know is that she wasn't from this world, and the noise she made is so deeply embedded in me that I'm certain I could be old and still hear it echoing inside my head. We never went camping again, and we never walked the Appalachian trails again. I regret that, because it was something I truly loved. But like I said before, I believe in the supernatural, and those mountains breathe things that we are not capable of understanding. What I'm about to share happened when I was 11 years old, in a part of my life that should have been defined by safety, routine, and family traditions, but instead became the foundation of a fear that followed me quietly into adulthood. I grew up in a remote area of West Virginia, the kind of place with so few residents that everyone knew each other by name, where neighbors didn't lock their doors, and where unfamiliar faces were immediately noticed and talked about. It was a place where trust wasn't something you earned. It was something you were born into, simply by being part of the community. Every year, right after the New Year's holidays, my parents and I would go camping in the forest near our home. continuing a tradition that had been started by my grandmother on my mother's side decades earlier. It wasn't just a trip, it was a ritual. We used those days to reflect on the year that had passed, talk about what we wanted to leave behind, and quietly set goals for the year ahead. It was always calm, reflective, and deeply personal, and I loved it more than any other tradition we had. It was, without question, the most important ritual in our family, and none of us could have imagined that one year would permanently destroy that sense of peace. I had grown up in those woods. Even at 11, I knew the trails, the terrain, and the seasonal changes well enough that my parents felt comfortable giving me a certain amount of freedom to explore on my own during the day. They trusted the forest, and more importantly, they trusted the people who lived around us. On the third day of the trip, I had wandered a short distance away from the campsite, collecting winter plants for a small notebook I kept, something between a hobby and a school project that I took very seriously. I was walking through the woods when I heard the sound. At first, it was distant and rhythmic, a constant noise that reminded me of metal striking packed snow. I remember stopping and listening, unsure whether to go back toward my parents or investigate further. I should have turned around immediately, but curiosity won. As I moved closer, the sound became clearer, heavier, and I realized it wasn't just metal hitting snow, but something being forcefully buried beneath it. I was a kid, and I was scared. But everything changed the moment I recognized the person responsible. It was our neighbor, a man I had known my entire life, someone who had watched me grow up, someone my parents trusted completely. Seeing him there filled me with instant relief, and without thinking twice, I let my guard down and acknowledged him. The reaction on his face is something I will never forget. For just a few seconds, I saw an expression that didn't belong to someone familiar. I still can't fully describe it, or even label it clearly as fear or shock, but I know I saw it, and I know it was real. He moved quickly, trying to conceal whatever he had been burying or digging up. But it was already too late. I had seen a human hand in the snow. My body went completely cold, and instinct took over. I ran. I didn't get far. He caught me easily, threw me to the ground, and at that point, I was screaming uncontrollably, panicked beyond any ability to think clearly. He grabbed something, whether it was already in his hand or within reach, I don't know, and struck me hard in the head. Everything after that went dark. I woke up in agony, my head throbbing, my mouth gagged, and my hands bound. He was calm in a way that made everything worse, calculated and frighteningly composed. He made it clear that I had two choices. I could disappear right there, buried in the forest, where no one would ever find me. Or I could leave and never tell anyone what I had seen. I was a child, terrified, barely able to process what was happening, and I agreed immediately, desperate to survive. Before letting me go, he made sure I understood that if I ever spoke about it, he would find me again, and he wouldn't stop with me. He would hurt my parents too. Then he released me. I ran in a blind panic, disoriented, freezing, completely lost. I don't know how long I wandered, but the next day I was found by a group of volunteers. My parents had reported me missing, and search efforts were already underway. I told everyone that I had gotten lost and hit my head on a tree. The hospital report said otherwise, noting that the injury was consistent with a powerful blow from an object, not an accidental fall. For a while, my parents were suspected. I remember the tension, The quiet conversations, the looks. Then, suddenly, the investigation shifted away from them. I never learned exactly why. For years after that, I lived in constant fear. Every time I saw that man, every time he spoke to my parents, like nothing had ever happened, something inside me twisted. I felt sick watching him smile, watching him exist freely, knowing what I knew. My mother noticed that I had changed, that I was quieter, more anxious. But she assumed it was trauma, stress, something that would eventually fade. It didn't. Eventually, we moved away. I grew up, reached adulthood, and finally went to the police to report everything that had happened all those years earlier. They listened. They took me seriously. But without evidence, without a body, without proof, there was nothing they could do. 2 days ago, as I'm writing this, I learned that he was found dead inside his home. The police still don't know exactly what happened, but in a place like that, things don't happen without reason. It feels like a reckoning, like unfinished business finally catching up to him. I don't feel relief. Not exactly. But for the first time in decades, I feel the possibility of peace. And after a lifetime of fear, that feels like something I've earned.